let's say we have a 16-year-old new driver. They have their license in their hand, they have the keys in their hand, and they're ready to go. But one of the things you tell them before they put that key into the ignition and pull away out of the driveway is, don't risk getting a ticket, but make sure you buckle your seatbelt. When we tell kids this type of rhetoric, what we're doing is presenting the negative, don't risk getting a ticket, and that can be negated or avoided if we follow the positive, which is buckling our seatbelt. The negative of getting a ticket can be avoided if we just follow the positive. That line of logic is what's called a negative positive. You can take a negative action and it won't happen as long as you follow the positive. Scripture is full of negative positive statements, and we're going to look at one and see how it functions and how to identify one of those in Scripture. So let's look at the definition of a negative positive and we'll jump into it. The definition of a negative positive is there are two alternative statements. One statement is denied by the other statement. The symbol that we're going to use for a negative positive is a minus and a plus, kind of like the math symbols, a minus and a plus, or a negative and a positive. The key words we're going to look for are but and not but, though and although. Those are the key words that we're going to look for in a negative positive. So let's look at an example from Scripture. Let's look at an easy one from Ephesians 5:17. This Scripture says, "Do not be foolish, but understand what the will of the Lord is." So let's identify our key phrases. We look at "do not be foolish," and there it is staring at our face, a but understand what the will of the Lord is. So we're going to separate "do not be foolish" and make that another proposition right underneath it by separating the B-U-T, but understand what the Lord is. We're going to separate that into a different proposition. So we have two propositions here in this verse. The first is "do not be foolish," and the second is "but understand what the will of the Lord is." So what's the negative and what is the positive? Obviously, the negative is "do not be foolish." Foolishness is never looked at as a positive aspect. The foolishness can be avoided if we do what? Understand what the will of the Lord is. That's the positive. When we understand what the will of the Lord is, the foolishness of our actions can be avoided. So there's a negative and a positive. The negative of foolishness, the positive of understanding what the will of the Lord is. Now, just as a note, it can often be hard to distinguish between an alternative and a negative positive. The way to tell them apart is to ask yourself whether the two statements are simply contrasting one another, or is one proposition being denied by the other, as in the Ephesians verse we just traced. This verse isn't contrasting the foolish person against the unfoolish person. This verse is asking the Christian to deny and eliminate foolishness. That's the negative, by understanding the will of the Lord. That's the positive. There's not a contrast. It's a denial of foolishness. So, this is a negative positive. A negative that can be avoided by adhering to a positive. Again, negative positive. Here's the bad thing, and you can avoid it or deny it or reject it by following the positive. There's all kinds of negative positives in Scripture. Jesus uses them quite frequently when he talks to his disciples or to the Pharisees and the Sadducees. So pay attention when you're looking through Scripture make note of those key words and find out where there's negative positives. Whenever you see a negative positive, you can see one thing we can avoid by following God's law and doing what he wants us to do in the positive. I'll see you in the next session.